In the bank lobby, my brother whispered, "Sign where I marked." I flipped to the last page, and then I froze. The paper felt heavier than it should have. The kind of weight that comes not from paper and ink but from something unspoken, something I couldn't yet name. My hand tightened around the pen he'd slid toward me, and for a second, I felt as if every eye in the room had turned to watch. The lobby was quiet, filled with the sterile hush of polished floors and faintly humming air. I could hear the shuffling of feet from an older couple waiting at the far end, the faint clicking of a teller's keyboard, the sound of coins being counted in the distance. It was an ordinary Tuesday, and yet nothing felt ordinary in that moment. My brother leaned closer, his breath warm against my ear, his voice low but firm, the way he used to talk to me when we were children and he was trying to coax me into trouble. "Just sign. It's all taken care of." The line he wanted me to sign was not just ink on paper. It was the kind of line that once drawn would not be erased. I looked at his handwriting, the neat little X he'd marked with a ballpoint, and I knew he had thought this through in advance. I wondered how long he had been planning it, how many nights he had sat with these documents, convincing himself I would comply. I looked up at him then, really looked at him. His jaw was clenched in that way it always was when he wanted control, his eyes sharp but avoiding direct contact. We'd sat across kitchen tables and argued over lesser things, the care of our parents, the sale of an old car, the petty inheritances that families sometimes let tear them apart. But this was different. This was trust written down and repurposed into leverage. I didn't sign, not immediately. My fingers hovered above the page, the pen trembling ever so slightly, betraying the storm I was trying to contain. My brother pressed his hand gently against mine, guiding it downward as though I were a child learning to write my name for the first time. That touch, patronizing, deliberate, sent a shiver through me. "Why?" I whispered, my voice so low I wasn't even sure if he heard. He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled tightly, a smile meant for the room, not for me, and nodded as though we were in complete agreement. To the onlookers, perhaps we looked like siblings united in a simple task, signing off some harmless document, but inside, my chest tightened with the realization that I was standing at the edge of something far larger than I had prepared myself for. I closed the folder slowly and placed the pen on top of it. His hand lingered for a moment, as though he might snatch it back, force me to continue. But I stood and walked away from the desk. My legs felt heavy, each step deliberate, like moving through water. Behind me, I could feel his stare, the heat of his frustration pressing between my shoulder blades. When I reached the glass doors of the lobby, I pushed them open and stepped into the brightness of the street. The air was warm, the kind of early spring warmth that carries the scent of damp soil and budding trees. I should have felt relief, the coolness of escape, but instead my stomach nodded. Betrayal doesn't announce itself with thunder or lightning. It slips in quietly, disguised as family, masked as duty. Wrapped in the thin paper of signatures, I walked aimlessly, turning corners without thought, until I found myself at the small cafe where I often sat with my notebook. I ordered tea without tasting the words, found a seat in the corner, and laid the folder in front of me. The waitress smiled politely, but I couldn't bring myself to smile back. My reflection stared at me from the glass window, a face pale, lips pressed tight, eyes distant. I hardly recognized myself. For years, I had told myself my brother and I were different from other siblings. We had endured storms together, stood shoulder to shoulder at funerals, shared laughter at weddings, carried secrets only we knew. When our father passed, it was my brother who placed his arm around me, as though he alone could anchor me in that sea of grief. That memory haunted me now, because the hand that once steadied me was the same hand that pushed a pen into mine today. I traced the edge of the folder with my fingertip, over and over, as though the motion might somehow erase what had just happened. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. Whatever was inside, whatever scheme had been set in motion, I already knew its essence. It was not about the papers. It was about power, about control, about the slow erosion of trust, until what remains is only obligation. The tea arrived, steaming gently. I stirred it with the small silver spoon, watching the liquid swirl into darker shades, and I thought about all the other moments I had signed things without reading, trusting because it was him. School forms, bills, legal papers. When our mother fell ill, he had always been the one to handle it, and I, weary of the details, had let him. How many times had I let his confidence silence my questions? How many times had I mistaken his certainty for protection? A young couple sat down at the table near mine, laughing softly, the woman brushing crumbs from the man's jacket with easy intimacy. I envied their simplicity, the trust so visible in their small gestures. I wondered if they would ever sit in a bank lobby years from now, one pressing the other to sign something neither understood. Would betrayal creep in quietly for them too? I sipped my tea, the heat burning the back of my throat, and for a moment, I welcomed the pain. It was honest, unlike the smile my brother had worn. By the time I left the cafe, dusk had begun to fall. The streets were softer now, lights flickering on, shadows lengthening. I walked home slowly, dreading the silence that awaited me. My apartment was just as I had left it, neat, quiet, orderly, but it felt changed, as though the walls themselves had overheard the bank lobby and were now holding their breath, waiting for me to confirm or deny what had transpired. I dropped the folder on the dining table and sat before it, staring. The room smelled faintly of lavender from the candle I had burned the night before, but the scent now felt cloying, too sweet. I lit no candle tonight. Instead, I sat in the dim light, hands folded, trying to steady the tremor that refused to leave. Trust is not broken in a single moment, I reminded myself. It frays, it wears thin, it gives way strand by strand until finally it snaps. Today was only the snap. The fraying had been happening all along. I thought of the subtle ways my brother had dismissed me in conversations, the decisions made without my input, the patronizing assurances that I didn't need to worry. Each memory landed like a stone, heavy and undeniable. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment his hand had pressed mine toward the page. In that gesture was everything: authority, dismissal, and the assumption that I would obey. The hum of the refrigerator in the next room kept me company, a low reminder of life's ordinary persistence. My phone buzzed once, a message from him, short, polite, almost casual. "We'll sort it out tomorrow." But I knew nothing would be sorted. Something had shifted permanently. Tomorrow would not return what today had taken. When dawn came, pale and quiet, I made coffee and sat at the table again with the folder unopened. The city outside was waking, buses rumbling, children calling, doors opening. The world went on as though nothing had changed, but inside me, the fracture widened. I thought of calling him, demanding answers, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I poured my coffee, black and bitter, and told myself that silence was its own kind of power. I didn't know then what the next weeks would bring, or how far the cracks would spread. I only knew that I had looked into my brother's eyes and seen something I could no longer ignore. And once seen, it could not be unseen. That morning, I carried the folder to my desk drawer and slid it inside. My hand lingered on the wood before closing it. I told myself I needed time, just time to think, to breathe, to gather what was left of my trust. But deep down, I knew that the act of putting it away was not postponement. It was refusal, quiet, unspoken, but absolute. And that refusal was the first step to walk a path I had never intended to walk. A path where family was no longer a refuge, but a test. A path that would force me to choose between loyalty and survival, between silence and my own voice. I hadn't yet spoken a word of it to anyone, but already, I felt the story beginning to write itself in the smallest of my actions: the way I locked the drawer, the way I washed my cup, the way I folded the dish towel and set it neatly on the counter as though order could shield me from chaos. By evening, I caught myself whispering the words aloud, almost without meaning to. "I won't sign." The sound startled me, as though it had come from someone else, yet it was my voice, my own, at last. The morning after I told myself I won't sign, the world seemed unchanged. Yet every detail carried a strange heaviness. The kettle whistled, the radio murmured the news, and traffic hummed outside my window, but each sound seemed distant, muffled by the echo of my brother's whisper in the bank. It clung to me like the faint scent of smoke after a fire, a reminder of something that would not be scrubbed away. I sat at the kitchen table with my cup of coffee, cooling, untouched, staring at the drawer where I had locked away the folder. I imagined him pacing in his own house, phone in hand, rehearsing the words he'd use next time. Would he come with anger, sharp and unyielding? Or would he soften his tone, layering false warmth over the steel of his intent? The uncertainty gnawed at me more than either outcome alone. The phone rang mid-morning. His name lit the screen. My hand hovered above it, the familiar tug of obligation pulling me, but I let it ring. Each vibration felt like a knock against my chest, steady and insistent. When the sound finally died, silence spread through the room like a release. I stared at the blank screen and thought, this is what distance feels like. This is what saying no costs. By noon, a message arrived. We need to finalize things soon. Don't complicate it. It's for both of us. I read it 3 times, the words blurring slightly as anger built behind my ribs. Don't complicate it, as though my hesitation was an inconvenience, a hiccup in his carefully laid plan, as though the signature he demanded was no heavier than signing for a package at the door. I didn't reply. Instead, I put on my coat and went for a walk. The air outside was brisk, the sky a pale gray, the kind that presses down on the city like a low ceiling. I walked with no destination, letting my feet choose the path, and with each step I tried to shake off the weight of his message. I passed shop windows filled with spring displays, pastel scarves, fresh flowers, new shoes, all promising renewal, simplicity, lightness. None of it reached me. At the park, I found a bench and sat. Children ran across the damp grass, their laughter carried by the wind, and a man threw a ball for his dog, who bounded with unshakable joy. I envied them all, their unbroken trust in the ordinary rhythms of life. I once believed family gave you that same assurance, that someone was always there to catch the ball, to call you home, to steady you. But what happens when family is the one who tips you off balance? I remembered our childhood then, not in vivid scenes but in fragments. His hand pulling me up a tree branch, his voice daring me into the creek, his shadow stretching long beside mine in the summer sun. He had always led, and I had always followed. That was the rhythm. Somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing how much of my life was written in the spaces he left for me. A woman about my age sat down on the other end of the bench, pulling out a paperback from her bag. She glanced at me briefly, her eyes kind but uninterested, then settled into her book. I envied her, to the luxury of being absorbed in a story that wasn't her own, the freedom to escape. I wanted that detachment, but no novel could pull me from the story I was now inside of. When I returned home later, the message still glowed on my phone. I deleted it without replying. The act felt small, almost petty, yet powerful. A refusal carried not in words, but in silence. Days stretched into a week, and with each one my brother's attempts grew sharper. First calls, then messages, then a voicemail left late at night. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Stop His tone was measured, but beneath it I heard the impatience, the insult that my resistance was unexpected. He had built his world on the certainty of my compliance, and now the ground was shifting beneath him. At work, I found it hard to concentrate. Numbers on the screen blurred, conversations drifted past me, and even routine tasks felt heavier. My colleagues noticed my distraction, but no one pressed me. I wore a polite smile, gave short answers, and guarded my silence like a fragile secret. At night, the silence grew louder. I found myself cleaning the apartment more than usual, scrubbing counters until they shone, folding laundry into neat stacks, aligning books on the shelf with military precision. It was as though by ordering the outside, I could calm the chaos inside. But no matter how neat the surfaces became, my chest carried the same restless tightness. One evening, I opened the drawer and pulled out the folder again. My hands shook slightly as I spread the papers across the table. Words swam before me, legal terms, financial figures, paragraphs of jargon, but beneath them, the truth was simple. This was about inheritance, land, property, money left behind by our parents, what I had believed we were sharing, he was quietly claiming, and the signature he wanted from me was not just a formality, it was consent. I sat back in the chair and closed my eyes. My parents' faces rose in my memory, my mother's careful handwriting in letters she left us, my father's voice reminding us, take care of each other when we're gone. The weight of their trust pressed on me, heavier than the papers. Would refusing to sign mean I was failing that duty, or was refusing the only way to honor it? I made tea, the familiar ritual grounding me. Boil the water, steep the leaves, pour, sip. As I stirred the spoon, I realized my brother must have known this would cut me so deeply. He had chosen the one battlefield where I was weakest, the promise of family. That knowledge stung more than the documents themselves. He hadn't stumbled into this. He had calculated it. The following weekend, he came to my door. I saw his figure through the peephole, shoulders squared, folder in hand. I didn't open. He knocked softly at first, then louder. It's just me, he called, his voice calm but edged. I leaned against the wall inside, holding my breath, willing myself into stillness. After several minutes, he left. A note slipped under the door read, We'll finish this soon. Don't drag it out. I burned the note in the sink, watched the paper curl and blacken, the letters disappearing into ash. My hand trembled holding the match, but when it was done, a strange calm settled over me. That night, I wrote in my journal for the first time in months. Words spilled onto the page, not about legalities or numbers, but about how it felt to be pressed by the very person who should have stood beside me. I wrote of trust, of silence, of the quiet power of refusal. When I finished, my hand ached, but my chest felt lighter. I began writing each night after that, not about him directly, not always, but about the small moments of the day, the way the neighbor's cat stretched across the fence, the scent of rain on the pavement, the warmth of my scarf against my neck. Each detail was mine alone, untouched by his demands. In recording them, I felt pieces of myself return. Still, the pressure didn't fade. A second voicemail came, angrier. You're being unreasonable. Don't ruin this for us. I replayed it twice, each time hearing the shift in his voice, not just impatience now, but fear. Fear that I might not bend this time, fear that his certainty about me was crumbling. For the first time, that thought gave me strength. His fear meant my silence mattered. My refusal, small as it seemed, was altering the story he had written for both of us. One evening, as I sat at the table with my tea, I whispered the words again, firmer now. I won't sign. This time, they didn't startle me. They steadied me. I knew part one of this ordeal had been shock, the sting of betrayal. Part two was different. This was the quiet turning inward, the testing of my own strength in the smallest of acts. A deleted message, a locked drawer, an unanswered door. I didn't yet know how far it would go, how much it would cost me, but I knew this. My brother's certainty had met its first true resistance, and it was mine. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Though the silence carried its own tension, my brother's calls slowed, his messages less frequent. At first, I thought it was a reprieve, but soon I understood it was not withdrawal, it was strategy. He was waiting me out. Certain I would grow weary of the pressure I had placed on myself. Silence from him made the rooms of my apartment seem louder. The ticking clock, the refrigerator's hum, the pipes sighing at night, every sound felt exaggerated, reminding me of the emptiness between four walls. I had always considered myself independent, comfortable in solitude, but independence is different when it's chosen. Now, it felt as though solitude was being used against me, like a net tightening. I began walking in the evenings, not far, just through nearby streets, where the houses leaned into each other, and porch lights flicked on as the sun dropped. I liked watching families gather at dinner tables, curtains drawn but voices carrying faintly through open windows. The sight was comforting, but it also stung, the reminder that somewhere along the way, my own family had shifted from sanctuary to battlefield. On one of those walks, I passed the library. Its tall windows glowed warmly, and for the first time in years, I went inside. The air smelled of paper and quiet, and the hush felt different from my apartment's silence. Gentler, welcoming. I wandered the shelves, running my fingers over spines, until I pulled out a book almost at random. I didn't need the story. I needed the reminder that there were words in the world untouched by him. I carried the book home, read a few pages before bed, and for the first time in weeks, sleep came more easily. Stories had always been my refuge, and returning to them felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. But outside that small solace, the reality pressed closer. At work, I overheard colleagues discussing mortgages, inheritances, debts, ordinary things, but each word felt barbed. I said little, not wanting to betray the turmoil I carried. Even small talk became a risk, because one question too close, "How's your family?" might unravel me. One Sunday, I saw him again. I had gone to the market for vegetables, the usual ritual of weighing tomatoes, selecting greens, exchanging coins with the vendor. As I turned, there he was, standing at the end of the row, hands in his pockets, watching me. Our eyes met, and in that brief exchange, everything unsaid passed between us. I didn't walk toward him, and he didn't move closer. After a moment, he turned away. I carried my basket home, my pulse racing, and realized that the market, once a place of comfort, now carried his shadow too. Betrayal doesn't stay confined to the moment it happens. It seeps outward, staining even the most ordinary corners of your life. That evening, I lit a candle, not lavender this time, but plain beeswax, warm and grounding. I sat with my journal and wrote about the market encounter. The weight of his stare, the way my chest tightened with both fear and defiance. As I wrote, I realized I was no longer just recording, I was testifying to myself, if no one else, that this was real, that my refusal was not weakness but choice. The folder remained in the drawer, untouched, yet its presence shaped everything. Sometimes, late at night, I imagined opening it, signing just to end the tension, but each time, I remembered the pressure of his hand guiding mine, and I knew that if I yielded now, it would not end. Signing would not restore peace. It would confirm his certainty that my silence, my hesitation, was only a prelude to surrender. Instead, I began noticing small ways I could reclaim space. I cooked meals more slowly, savoring each step. I took longer walks, exploring streets I hadn't before. I called an old friend, not to talk about my brother, but simply to hear a voice that carried no agenda. These small acts felt almost defiant, as though by living fully in the details of my life, I was resisting the reduction of myself to a signature. One night, while folding laundry, I found myself laughing softly at the absurdity of it. How one line on one page had expanded into such a chasm, yet the laugh caught in my throat, because it wasn't absurd, it was inevitable. The years of following, of letting him lead, had built to this. The signature was not the first demand, it was only the first I had refused. Spring edged closer, trees buddied along the sidewalks, children chalked hopscotch squares onto the pavement, and the days stretched longer. Life was renewing itself all around me, and in quiet ways. So was I. I still felt the weight of betrayal, the sting of his absence where closeness once lived. But beneath it all, something steadier was forming. I whispered it again one morning while pouring tea, not as a vow this time, but as truth. I won't sign. The words no longer sounded like defiance, they sounded like me. The quiet could not last forever, I knew it, and yet each day I hoped the silence between my brother and me might stretch just a little longer. Give me space to breathe without his shadow pressing in. But one evening, just as I was setting down my tea, there was a knock at my door. It wasn't tentative. It was steady, certain, the kind of knock that announced itself as more than a request. I didn't move at first. My heart beat in my throat as I stood in the hallway, staring at the door as though it were a living thing. Then his voice came, low and even. We need to settle this. I pressed my palm against the wall, willing myself not to answer. The silence between us stretched, taut as wire. After a minute, the knock came again, louder this time. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The words stung because they were so familiar. The same tone he used when we were children, and I resisted. Some game he'd invented. When he would insist I was only complicating things, he had carried that same certainty into adulthood, and I had allowed it to shape me for too long. I whispered to myself, barely audible, I won't sign, and with that, I turned away from the door. Eventually, his footsteps retreated down the hallway, slow and deliberate, as though he wanted me to hear the weight of his leaving. When the building door slammed shut, I exhaled. My hands were trembling, but I felt a strange surge of steadiness beneath the tremor. I had held the line, even in silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed replaying the sound of his knock, the way it echoed through the apartment, the way my pulse hammered as I resisted. Yet beneath the unease was something new, a flicker of strength. Resistance was no longer just a thought. It was action, lived in my refusal to open the door. In the days that followed, I began moving differently. I walked with my head a little higher, even if no one else noticed. At work, I spoke up in meetings more often, no longer content to let others fill the silence. Small things, yes, but they felt connected, as though refusing to sign had unlocked a part of me that had long been quiet. Still, his presence lingered. A letter arrived one morning, the envelope thick, his handwriting scrawled across the front. My stomach tightened as I held it. I considered leaving it unopened, but curiosity won. Inside were more papers, copies, explanations, notes in the margins. He had underlined phrases, circled figures, annotated as though guiding a child through homework. At the bottom, in bold letters, he had written, "This is the right thing. Don't delay any longer." I folded the papers back into the envelope without reading further. The condescension of it struck deeper than the demand itself, that he still believed he could direct me, that my hesitation was merely ignorance waiting to be corrected. I set the envelope in the drawer with the folder and locked it again. This time, the act felt less like hiding and more like deliberate rejection. That evening, I went for a longer walk than usual, tracing streets I hadn't visited in years. I ended up near the river, where the water moved steady and indifferent, carrying away leaves and branches without effort. I stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of it, and felt something inside me settle. The river did not resist what came, but neither did it cling. It flowed forward. Perhaps that was what I needed to learn, not just to resist my brother, but to let go of the idea that his approval, his agreement, was necessary for my own life to move. When I returned home, I lit the plain beeswax candle and opened my journal. I wrote not about him this time, but about the river, about its steady patience. For the first time since the bank lobby, my writing did not feel like testimony against betrayal. It felt like a map towards something else. A week later, I saw him again, not by chance. This time, he came to my workplace, waiting near the entrance as I left for lunch. His expression was controlled, polite enough for public view, but his eyes carried the same hard glint I had seen in the bank lobby. "We can't keep doing this," he said quietly, falling into step beside me. I kept walking. "Doing what?" I asked, my voice steady. "This book, you know it's only paperwork. You're dragging it out." I stopped then, turned to face him. For a moment, I saw the boy I had once followed, older now, sharper, but still carrying that same certainty that the world would bend his way. And for the first time, I didn't shrink under it. "It's not just paperwork," I said. "It's trust. And that's already broken." His jaw tightened. "You're making this about more than it is." "No," I said, softer now, but certain. "You are." The silence between us was thick, filled with all the words we'd never said. After a moment, he shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and walked away. I stood watching his back retreat until it disappeared around the corner. When I finally sat down for lunch, my hands were trembling again, but my heart felt strangely calm. I had spoken aloud what I had only whispered before. The words had left me, carried into the world, and they couldn't be taken back. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace, not because the conflict was over. I knew it wasn't, but because I had stepped out from under the shadow of his certainty. He might come again with papers, with arguments, with anger, but I had found something he hadn't accounted for, my own voice, and once spoken, it could not be silenced. I had thought speaking the words aloud would be the hardest part. It's not just paperwork, it's trust. But once they were spoken, something inside me changed. The silence that followed was no longer filled with doubt, it was filled with clarity, even if that clarity was painful. My brother's visits stopped after that day outside my office. For a week, there were no calls, no notes under the door, no letters in my mailbox. The quiet unsettled me at first. I wondered what strategy he was planning now, whether he was gathering others into his side of the story. Cousins, mutual friends, anyone who might press me in ways he could not. But the days slipped by, and no word came. Instead of fear, a strange calm began to take root. I noticed it in the way I woke each morning, not with the heaviness of dread, but with a kind of alert stillness. I carried on with work, with my walks, with the small rituals that steadied me. The folder remained locked away, untouched, but its hold over me had weakened. It was no longer a looming threat, but simply an object I chose not to yield to. Then one evening, the phone rang again. His voice on the line was measured, polite almost, but I heard the strain beneath it. "We should talk," he said. "Come over for dinner tomorrow, just you and me." For a moment, I nearly refused outright, but something in his tone, not conciliatory, not demanding, but restless, made me curious. I agreed, my voice flat, and when I hung up, I stared at the phone for a long while, wondering why I had said yes. The next evening, I walked to his house with deliberate steps. The street was quiet, lined with trees just beginning to flower, their petals drifting down like pale confetti. It felt almost ceremonial, as though the world itself marked this meeting. He greeted me at the door with a strained smile, ushered me inside, and led me to the dining table already set for two. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, familiar and homey, a scent that once would have comforted me, but now it felt staged, like an old play being performed for the sake of appearances. That we ate in silence at first. He spoke of work, of the weather, of things that carried no weight. I answered politely but briefly, unwilling to give him the illusion that this was just another evening. Finally, he set down his fork and looked directly at me. "You're being stubborn," he said, voice low but sharp. "You're making this into something it isn't." I held his gaze. And what do you think it is? Paperwork. A signature. That's all. You're complicating it because you want to prove something. The words struck me. Not because they surprised me, but because they revealed what he truly thought. To him, my refusal was not about principle, or trust, or betrayal. It was about rebellion, about me stepping out of the role he had written for me. I set down my glass. It's not about proving anything, it's about seeing clearly, maybe for the first time. His jaw tightened. Seeing what? That I've been the one to keep things together all these years, that without me, you wouldn't. Without you, I interrupted, my voice steady. I might have had the chance to learn how to stand on my own sooner. The silence that followed was sharp, cutting through the room like glass. He stared at me, eyes narrowed, as though he couldn't recognize the person sitting across from him. Perhaps he couldn't. Perhaps I couldn't either. Finally, he leaned back, exhaling hard. So this is who you want to be. Difficult, ungrateful, alone. I didn't flinch. No, this is who I already am, and I'm not signing. The words hung in the air, heavier than any I had spoken before. They weren't whispered in solitude, scribbled in a journal, or muttered over tea. They were spoken directly to him, in his house, at his table. And in saying them, I felt something unshackled inside me. His face hardened, the polite mask slipping. For a moment, I thought he might raise his voice, but instead he stood, collected the plates with sharp movements, and carried them into the kitchen. The clatter of dishes against the sink echoed like slammed doors. I sat there, still, my hands folded in my lap. My pulse raced, but beneath it was calm, a steady, rooted calm that surprised me. I had feared this confrontation for weeks, imagined it as a storm I might not survive. But the storm had broken, and here I was, sitting upright, unshaken. When he returned, his expression was carefully neutral again. "You'll regret this," he said flatly. "Maybe," I answered. "But if I do, it will be my regret, not yours." He looked at me for a long moment, as though weighing the truth of my words. Then, without another sentence, he walked to the door and opened it. The conversation was over. I stood, smoothed my coat, and walked past him without hesitation. The night air outside was cool, almost sweet, and as I walked down the steps, I realized my hands weren't trembling. My chest felt light, almost weightless. I didn't know what would come next, whether he would pursue new tactics, whether others in the family would be pulled into the conflict, whether the papers would linger like ghosts. But I knew this much. I had faced him, spoken my refusal, and left without bending. And that, I thought as I walked home beneath the blooming trees, was its own kind of freedom. In the days after that dinner, a strange stillness settled over me. It wasn't peace exactly, too much had been broken for that. But it was steadier than the anxious silence I had lived in before. I had spoken my refusal directly to him, and the sky hadn't fallen. The earth had gone on turning. The realization felt both humbling and liberating. Sometimes survival is not about winning, but about refusing to surrender. My brother's silence this time was deeper, heavier. No calls, no knocks, no letters. For years, he had filled the space between us with his certainty, his instructions, his endless assurances that he knew best. Now there was only quiet. It might have unsettled me once, but now I found myself growing into it. Silence, I realized, could be fertile ground. I began noticing things I hadn't before. The way morning light fell across my kitchen table, painting the wood in shifting gold. The sound of sparrows gathering on the balcony railing, their small wings fluttering as they argued and scattered. The way the barista at the cafe smiled when I ordered tea, as though she knew I had chosen that seat in the corner enough times to make it mine. These were details I had overlooked when my days were filled with his demands. Now they felt like small anchors, holding me to myself. One afternoon, I opened the drawer where the folder lay. I placed it on the table, opened it, and spread the pages out in front of me. For the first time, I read them slowly, carefully, taking in every word: property lines, financial accounts, signatures, clauses. Beneath the legal language, I could see the shape of his plan clearly: to secure everything, to tie my name to his will, to make my consent nothing more than a formality. But as I read, I felt no panic. The words were just words now. They no longer carried the weight of betrayal, because betrayal had already been revealed and named. These pages were not my cage. They were his map, a map I had chosen not to follow. When I finished, I stacked the papers neatly, slid them back into the folder, and tucked it into the back of the drawer again. This time, I didn't block it. I didn't need to. The power it once held over me had dissolved. That evening, I wrote in my journal, I am no longer waiting for him to come back. I am no longer waiting for resolution that will never come. The act of not signing is resolution enough. The words steadied me as I wrote them. They were not defiance anymore, but acceptance. Weeks slipped into months. Spring deepened into summer. The air warm and fragrant. Trees thick with leaves. My brother and I did not speak. I heard bits of his life through distant relatives. A comment here, a passing mention there, but I felt no urgency to chase the details. His story was his now, separate from mine. One day, I found myself back at the river. The water was higher than before, moving fast, glinting with sunlight. I stood watching it for a long time, the steady current carrying debris away, never clinging, never resisting. I thought of my parents then, of my father's voice asking us to take care of each other. For a moment, guilt rose in me, sharp and aching. Was this what he meant? Or had I failed that promise? But then I looked at the water again, the way it flowed forward without question. And I understood something I hadn't before. Taking care of each other did not mean surrendering myself. It did not mean carrying his will at the cost of my own. Perhaps what they had wanted was not blind loyalty, but honesty. And honesty, now, meant standing where I stood as I turned to leave. A breeze stirred the branches above, scattering a few leaves across the water. I watched them spin, carried swiftly downstream, and felt a quiet echo inside me. I could not control where the river carried them, but I could choose how I stepped away from its banks. That night, I lit the beeswax candle again and poured a glass of wine. I sat at the table, the drawer closed beside me, and felt the weight of the weeks lift. My life was not free of pain, not free of the fracture that betrayal had carved, but it was mine again. That mattered more than anything. I whispered the words one last time, not as defiance, not as vow, but as truth lived and complete. I won't sign. And with that, I blew out the candle, the smoke curling upward, fading into the night.